This is Moral of the Story. Interesting people telling their favorite short stories and then breaking them down to understand what makes them so good. I'm your host, Max Chapovsky. Today's guest is Kevin Pang, author, journalist, magician, Little League baseball umpire, producer, theater music director, award-winning filmmaker, cooking show host, and, of course, foodie of the highest caliber, with a James Beard Award to prove it. An eclectic mix of adventures, yes, but it's not all that surprising when you unroll the scroll that is Kevin's life. In fact, the trajectory starts to make a whole lot more sense when you dig deeper. Born in Hong Kong, Kevin immigrated with his parents to the US at age 6. To call his relationship with his dad strained would be an understatement. Kevin embraced Western culture while his parents were firmly rooted in the Eastern way of life, with no interest in assimilating. This dual cultural experience, to put it mildly, gave rise to dual identities. Kevin was, in his own words, American during the day and Chinese after school. The arguing and fights with his dad were constant, ranging from smoldering embers to full-fledged conflagrations. The Eastern cultures put a high emphasis on respect for elders, but Kevin was recalcitrant, insistent on doing things his own way. From refusing to speak Cantonese to bleaching his hair blonde, an act that elicited fury from his dad, who accused him of being ashamed of his Chinese heritage. Kevin was raised in Toronto and Seattle, working at the Pike's Place Fish Market in high school. After moving to the Windy City, he worked as a metro reporter at the Chicago Tribune. Meanwhile, the relationship with his dad, now 2,000 miles away, was barely aglow, kept alive through a weekly phone call filled with the most superficial of pleasantries and small talk. Everything changed when Kevin was offered a position on the paper's food writing staff. He had zero experience except for one highly qualifying line item. He was Cantonese, steeped in the region's food-centric philosophy and a deep, though perhaps dormant, love of cooking. And this would be the key to unlock not just his future career, but transform his relationship with his dad. Jeffrey Pang had an obsession with food that was at once borderline manic and completely culturally acceptable. And after Kevin became a food writer, he and his father, for the first time ever, shared a mutual interest. The weekly phone calls evolved from weather forecasts to deep and analogy-drenched tutorials on the way a shumai's wrapper should caress its filling or the proper way to braise pork belly. 5-minute calls regularly stretched to 30 minutes or more. After his father started making cooking videos on YouTube, Kevin was shocked to learn that not only did his parents have a loyal audience, their viewer metrics were impressive. But the coup de grace to their fraught relationship came when Kevin learned why his father started to make the videos. It was for Kevin, for when his parents were no longer around to prepare the dishes for him. And so, as the family recipes migrated from the carefully maintained spiral notebook to the world of online content, so did Kevin's relationship with his dad level up. Meanwhile, Kevin continued channeling his energy into his culinary pursuits, co-directing the critically acclaimed film For Grace, which follows brilliant but tormented chef Curtis Duffy in the months leading up to the opening of his first restaurant, Grace, which would go on to earn 3 Michelin stars, creating and running the Onion's food spin-off The Takeout, and joining America's Test Kitchen as editorial director and co-host of the Hunger Pangs cooking show, a duty he gladly shares with his dad. And almost as a bow on their converging character arcs, Kevin and his dad are releasing a cookbook of Cantonese cuisine entitled A Very Chinese Cookbook, out on October 24th of this year. Writing a book is hard, and although it's bound to do well considering the following of its authors, my sense is that if you ask Kevin what he really thinks, he'd tell you that just being back in the kitchen with his dad made the whole thing worth it. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Wow, Max, that felt like being on an episode of This Is Your Life or My Funeral, one of the two. But it's so great to be here, Max. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. Thanks for being here. So you are here to tell us a story. Is there anything we should know before we get started? If you want to set the stage.
Yeah, I think you set it up quite well with a lot of context, but I want to tell the story of after I had become a food writer, there was one moment that really precipitated everything that happened over the following 12 years.
I love it. All right, well, let's get into it. Tell me a story.
So, Max, you know that I become a food writer, and that was one way that gave a reason for my dad and I to speak together. We would, rather than having these really nothing phone calls at all. I mean, it was the most cordial of calls. We would call each other. We would say, hey, how you doing? what did you eat? Did you go to Costco? Like, are you hanging out with mom? That sort of thing, right? And the thing is that we did fight, but most of the time, it wasn't fighting. It was having a cordial conversation about nothing at all.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you can relate. It's just when you feel obligated to talk to someone that you care about, but then you really have nothing to say. And so you resort to the same 3 or 4 things that you talk about every single week. And so our relationship was just in a holding pattern. That's what it was. So even after I became a food writer, we still had these sorts of things. We were talking about how to roast pork belly, but then beyond food, it was just like, hey, how's it going? That sort of thing. So one day in 2012, you had mentioned I received this email from my dad, this forwarded email that says, Jeffrey Pang wants you to check out this YouTube video. Now, when you are, back in your 20s and you receive an email from your parents that says, check out this YouTube video, what do? You delete it. Because you don't look at these forwarded emails. You think, well, there's probably some crazy conspiracy theory or something political. I'm not going to read this. I'm not going to have time for this, right? And then a few weeks later, my mother contacted me and said, hey, Kevin, have you seen this video that your dad sent? I'm like, no. And she said, you should look at it. So I clicked on it, and the first thing I saw was it was called creative production, and the EAT in the middle of creative was highlighted. It says eats, right? I'm like, all right, that's kind of cheeseball. And it had royalty-free music, stuff that you didn't pay for, right? Just something you just got from the internet for free. And then I saw a photo of my mom and her mom, my grandmother, and I thought, what the hell is this? And then I saw my mom's hands. I noticed her wedding band, which is recognizable, and she was massaging dough. And she was rolling out the dough, and there were scallions on it. And I thought, wait a minute. This is my mom making scallion pancakes, which is something that I grew up eating, something my grandmother would make, and something that I loved to eat when I was a kid. And they were making their own YouTube cooking show. And this was my parents are tech-phobic people. These videos were lo-fi. And when I saw this, I thought, what the hell is this? I was completely shocked. And the biggest shock was that they kept doing these videos. They were like 20 videos, in the ensuing months, in the weeks and months, right? And some of them had more than 500,000 views. And in total, it was more than like 2 million views combined. Now, this was back in 2012, 2013, back when, getting 2 million views was pretty hard. I mean, like now today, you can burp in church and you can get like 10 million views on TikTok, right? It's pretty easy to like score. Yeah. But back then, it was kind of hard to like get that. And my parents were doing that. And I was in digital media. And I'm like, okay, I'm helping produce video content at my work. And they're getting more views than I was. Like, what was going on? So many months later, as you alluded to, when I asked him, like, why are you making these videos? Like, are you trying to get likes or, you're trying to make money? And they're making like $60 a month. And, my dad's able to take my mom out to a nice restaurant, which was cool. They said that, well, you and your sister are not exactly the most communicative of people, right? And, we understand we don't really speak the same language, right? And so, like, there's a lot of things that get lost in translation. And they said that we wanted to speak to you in a medium that you would understand. And you guys live in the digital medium. You live in YouTube land. So the only way that we can talk to you guys, you and your sister, is through YouTube. And one day when, and this is my parents speaking, when we're no longer around and you grow older and you realize, well, maybe they, hey, your parents weren't all too bad. They did do something, right? And one day when you think about some of the food that you grew up eating and you are thinking about that dish and how you just want to recreate it, and we're no longer around, we'll have these instructions for you. So it's almost like they're making a time capsule for you to discover later in life, except more than 2 million other views people have seen these videos as well too. So I think from that point on, it certainly the relationship got deeper, which is not to say that we're still not arguing from time to time, but we now have deeper conversations than just, hey, how you doing? Did you go to Costco? What did you eat last night, right? We actually have substantive conversations now. And who knew that food was going to be our lingua franca?
Yeah.
That this was going to be the way that we would talk to each other. In Cantonese, there's a saying, we don't really say, hey, how you doing? Hi. We say, have you eaten yet? That's the phrase you greet other people with. I'm sure other communities have something similar, but food is so integral to us that, you know, we will avoid conversations about relationships, about geopolitical strife, but we will use food as a way to broach those subjects.
Yeah.
So, you know, who knew that a simple email 12 years ago would lead to all these things, lead to a cooking series that I'm doing with my dad and a cookbook, but, you know, most of all, improving parental relationships.
What went through your mind when you realized that they went through such incredible effort just to communicate with you and your sister?
I think it wasn't until years later when I became a parent myself. You know, I've got a 7-year-old now, right? And and I'm sure many parents go through this. They will soon realize that, oh, this is why your parents did that thing. They tried their best. They're by no means perfect parents. I don't know any parents who are. And it wasn't until my dad was telling me a story about how when he was 5, his mother, my grandma, and they were growing up in Hong Kong, they were poor. She would take him to the market. There were no TVs, radios, you know, in their household back then. They had nothing to do, right? There was no internet, no tablet. So we had no babysitters. They had no babysitters.
Right.
So my grandma would take my dad out to the market to go shopping. And they didn't have a refrigerator back then, too. So they had to buy these things fresh every day, right? It's not like today you go to Costco. I keep plugging Costco. Costco should give me some residual here, you know? But they're not going to a supermarket once a week. They're going every single day, sometimes twice a day, to buy fresh produce, meats, fish, and things like that. And so when my grandmother would take my dad there, she would teach him about what to look for in an eggplant. It should be this specific color. It should be firm. You should be able to hold it. It should have some bounce to it. You should be able to, you know, use tactile, also your senses, your visual senses to be able to like tell whether something's fresh or not, right? And then afterward, if he was being a good boy, my grandma would buy my dad a bowl of like noodle soup as like a reward, you know, in the same way that I would buy a Big Mac for my kid, right, if he's hungry. And then I never envisioned my dad as the same age as my child. And it's like, you always look at your parent as parents. That is, you always see them as older than you, right? You always see them at a certain age or older, right? But you would never imagine them as a 5-year-old. And I had a kid who back then was 5, right? And so it was for the first time I thought, you know, this person, you know, my father, who I have all this arguments and strife with, right? He was at one point this innocent kid who was perhaps curious and scared of the world and had hopes and fears and dreams, just like my child does now, right? And that was the moment that I thought, oh, this guy's a human too. He's not like some automaton who's trying to, you know, annoy you or like ruin your life or just make your life hard. So it wasn't years later until I became a parent that I realize, oh, well, now I see what they're trying to do. And, it is both quite humbling. And you think, well, I wasn't the easiest kid to be raised as well too.
Yeah.
I was, as you said, recalcitrant. I was being annoying. I was being ironic. They had no idea what irony was, right? They don't know what sarcasm is. And so when you don't understand sarcasm and you say things that are the opposite of what you mean, they just become confused.
Yeah.
And so that just sows more confusion. So I think really becoming a parent, that was probably the moment that I saw my parents as not just parents, but as human beings.
Totally. And when you are, a lot of the time, that doesn't actually happen until we become parents. And by that point, our own parents are so much older. And so we kind of have less time with them, less time during which we understand them more as people who are imperfect. And what I find so interesting is, to your point, when we're younger, we see our parents as people who are static, that have everything figured out, who are who they are, and we just kind of live in their world. And when we become parents, we realize through our interactions with our own kids that actually our parents didn't have it all figured out. And maybe without telling us, they were questioning their decisions that they made around us, or different, or their paths, right, through life, but they never let us know any of that. And so we never knew that backstory until we sort of reverse engineered it when we had kids. And then through those conversations with our own parents, we're like, oh my God, like, why didn't you tell me any of this stuff?
Yeah, because we never asked.
Right.
Nor will we have a reason to ask.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Are your parents still around, Max?
Yeah, they are.
So one thing you just said is that, like, how lucky some of us are to, like, still have those parents around to, like, understand fully. It's like, now I get it. And to be able to tell them that. I have a lot of friends who have become parents, and their parents are not around anymore. It's like they don't get the opportunity to tell them,
right,
now I understand, and now I empathize with you. So I guess that makes us very lucky people.
It really does. It really does. Whatever, limited time we have left with them, it really does help us create a richer relationship out of it. What I find so interesting is when you talk about how your dad's mom would take him to the market. In this day and age, we can just leave our kids at home in front of the TV or with a babysitter while we run all the errands. And they live this super charmed life where they get to go to birthday parties and activities and stuff. And then we have to do all of that stuff, drive them around. But we also then have to do all the behind the scenes boring stuff that makes their lives easy. But the flip side of that is they don't get those moments that your dad, for example, still remembers. The moments when they're at the store and they figure out how to tell if an eggplant is good, right? Because and so I always struggle with that. Like, how much should we take our kids with us just to run the boring errands, even though they absolutely hate it? Because during those boring errands, they learn life isn't all peachy and you have to do boring stuff to do stuff that you like, right? But also they get these random moments with us that maybe in the moment they don't want to be having those moments. They want to be in front of the TV watching, their show. But down the road, they're going to be like, oh my gosh, I cherish those moments so much. And I think that's almost a missed opportunity. Like, there was Kevin Hart has an autobiography that he wrote. And in the autobiography, he talks about how his mom would drag him with her to run her errands. And they had to take public transportation, 4 or 5 buses. It would take, 2 hours to get somewhere, right? And then they would have to schlep all the groceries back to their house. And in the moment, while that was happening to him, he probably was cursing his life, like lamenting every moment that maybe his friends were out playing, but his mom couldn't leave him home alone because they didn't have a babysitter. So she dragged him to do all these errands. Now he looks back on those moments and says, wow, that gave me discipline. That gave me patience. That gave me creativity and the ability to not drive myself crazy while I was sitting on the bus looking at the person across from me for a half an hour. It almost seems to me like, I hate to be like the nostalgic guy that kind of yearns for the days long gone, but I do feel like we were forced to have certain experiences that our kids aren't having as much because they don't have to, because we have the resources for them to not have them.
Well, I think we have to be really conscious about building in those moments, those boring moments that are, in retrospect, are quite instructive. And, I'm sure a lot of parents, you've heard your parents say, you'll thank me later, you'll thank me later. And so that's certainly a mantra that keeps running through my head now. One thing that I think we can do, and I really try to do, and I suppose that I am fortunate enough to be able to do, is especially post-COVID, post-lockdown, there's a term, I think, the travel industry called revenge travel, because everyone just like pent up and they just want to go out again.
Totally.
But I realized that, I can spend $100 on a Lego set for my kid who loves it for exactly 48 hours, and then he dismantles it, and then it just becomes integrated into this part of this growing pile of, Lego pieces that will never be built again. And there goes my $100, right?
Totally.
Versus taking my kid out to travel. And we did that last year. We went to 4 different places in 2022, and we're traveling again this year. And I just realized that the thing that I want to do more with my family than anything else is to travel. I don't need clothes. I don't need a Tesla. I don't need a new house. I'm fine with sort of like what I have. We live with very simple means. But the one thing I don't want to compromise on is travel, because I want my kid to have those experiences, to go to a different country and try to speak someone else's language, try to order a pain au chocolat. My kid, 7, he doesn't really speak French, but he knows how to say, je voudrais un pain au chocolat, s'il vous plaît, right?
Yep.
And I'm very touched when he says that. So I think just building in moments for our children, I think that is sort of my top parental responsibility, is make sure that, that they, years from now, they can think back and say, my parents took me here. We had these moments. Not all of it was easy. It took 14 hours to get here. We missed our connecting flights. But you know what? It's all part of it. And I think that those moments are really instructive.
100%. I mean, the downside of living where we live is that we're surrounded by people who aren't struggling, right? At least for the most part financially, right? And the byproduct of that is having kids who are entitled if you don't course correct them, right? And so I was talking to somebody, we were kind of joking about this, but they were like, the weather wasn't good, and we were about to go home, and he was like, you know what? I actually don't mind if it rains. Like it'll be good for them. Life isn't all about like sunshine and rainbows. You have to make them a little bit uncomfortable. He was like, sometimes I'll make the tub a little bit colder, right?
Yeah.
He's like,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not suggesting you do this, but I made the joke that like you dip them in a little cold plunge and then you put them in the tub, right?
Right.
My wife did not approve of that statement, but it's all about showing them that the world doesn't revolve around them.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Because they have to order, a chocolate croissant in French, right? Or, and it's allowing them to understand adversity while they are still at home, and while you can pick them up and explain to them both what happened, how to address it, and say, things like this happen more often than you're used to.
Yeah. I think making sure that our children have empathy for other people, that's really important, but also they need to struggle a little bit.
Correct.
It's like, I think one of my favorite things to say to my 7-year-old is like, you figure it out. Mm-hmm. You got to figure this out yourself, man. Mm-hmm. So I think that's not being negligent. That's in fact being really helpful. I read a book that really changed my life. Do you ever read the book Anti-Fragile?
I've heard of that book.
Yeah, by Nassim Taleb. And I love that book because the central thesis is that you should be embracing uncertainty. You should be embracing you should be the opposite of fragile, which is anti-fragile, right? It's like, think about like the way that you exercise, right? You do not grow until you introduce some trauma to your muscles.
Correct.
To, you got to work out, and that can be painful and not uncomfortable at many times, but that is ultimately good for you. Now you take that and you apply that to, whatever emotional trauma, whatever discomfort, and like we need to be resilient.
Yes.
And the way to become resilient people, to not sort of wither at the first sight or the first feeling of discomfort, is you need to experience some heartache. You need to experience some some shit in your life, right?
Totally.
So I really like the idea. Now, how do you do that without throwing them straight into the fire? Like that's the balancing act. But yeah, that book really I think is a good operating philosophy for us.
I'm going to definitely check that out. I think that for our kids, if they don't experience discomfort, we're doing them a disservice.
Totally.
When my kids get mad at me because I'm making them do something that they don't want to do, and they yell at me, and I hold my ground, which is really hard for me because I'm constantly questioning, am I being too hard on them? But I also say to them, you might not like what's happening right now, and you might not understand what I'm about to tell you, but you'll get it later. It is my responsibility as your parent to send into the world an empathetic, kind, resilient human being.
Yeah, totally.
And the only way to do that is for you to be uncomfortable sometimes.
Yes. One of my favorite quotes someone told me is like, the best things in life are on the other side of comfort.
Yeah.
Which I really love that. And I think that is something that I really try to abide by at all times.
Totally. Do you recall a moment during, these last few years when you've gotten closer with your dad, where he said something to you that just kind of was so deep, but he almost said it kind of, it was almost like a throwaway comment, but he said it and you were like, oh my God, I cannot believe he just said that to me. Like, this is such a big moment.
I don't remember the specifics, but I remember very vividly the feeling that I felt when he said whatever it was that he said. And I had said something, and sort of my standard operating state is to be respond with perhaps some humor or with some sarcasm,
Mm-hmm.
but always like in a joking, playful manner, right? And when I said it to him, he responded back with me with sarcasm as well too.
Wow.
And I thought, like, number one, this is a hilarious line coming from a 72-year-old Chinese man, right? Like, you're able to, like, that is like, if you're in a writer's room of a late night talk show and you like respond with this line, like, I would high five you because it was like really, really hilarious.
Yeah.
And I forgot what that line is, but I just remember him, oh, now you're like responding to me. It's like, this is like, we're engaging in like verbal, like playful fisticuffs now.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, how do you know humor or sarcasm or irony, right?
Yeah.
And that was the moment that I thought, okay, it further chipped away this notion that you're not just this like elder figure, stoic figure. Like, you actually have a sense of humor,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to like go toe to toe with me. And I thought, you're a human being.
Yeah.
You're not a robot. You're a human being. And so I don't remember what it was he specifically said, but I remember the response was so unexpected and surprising and hilarious that it just like knocked me back.
I'm sure. It actually makes me think, do you ever think that maybe your parents held back on some of those parts of their personalities while you were younger for whatever reasons they might have had, and they didn't want to sort of, fully show the breadth of their personality to you until you got mature enough to experience it?
I don't think it was any conscious thing, but like, I didn't really go up to them like, after dinner to be like, hey, let's have this conversation. Like I would just be off into my world. I'd be playing Nintendo or doing my homework, right? So I did not create those opportunities for them to be able to
Hmm.
express those sorts of things. I mean, as any kid would, it's like you don't really want to hang out with your parents, right? So I think it wasn't that they were holding back. It's that I never allowed them the space or the opportunity to express those things. And now that I'm, one of the great things about working on this cookbook is that I'm talking to them 3, 4 times a week. I'm on the phone with them on Zoom calls for hours at a time, talking to them, interviewing them. And when forced to do this professionally
Hmm.
is when personally, like this stuff is actually coming out. So it's almost like my
Interesting.
work, professionally, I am being forced to have a relationship with my parents, right?
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a very powerful thing, and you won't believe how many people have told me that they wish they had this opportunity with their parents. And I didn't really think much of it. It's like I never saw this as like, oh, here's an opportunity for me to reconcile any sort of like fraught relationship, right? I just thought I get to do a cookbook. That's fun, right? But when I heard that, I realized like, oh, maybe I am lucky to be able to have this. And yeah, who would have thought that this 30-year-old food media company would help repair whatever fractured relationship, which is kind of amazing.
Totally. We were talking about this screenplay that I wrote before we started recording, and uh, I never let my parents read it. So I wrote it in the spring of 2020, and then I revised it, and sort of the working draft was from September of 2020. And it goes really deep into the complexity of the relationship that I have with my dad, right? And what's so interesting is the more I got into that screenplay, the deeper I got into it, ironically, the more I started to understand where my parents were coming from, because I didn't want to make the character simple so that there's an obvious villain and an obvious, like an obvious protagonist, obvious antagonist. I wanted to make each character relatable, because in reality, somebody can relate to him, somebody can relate to me, to, to my mom, to my brother. And so it wasn't supposed to be a very sort of black and white situation, which in reality, it's obviously not. My dad turned 70 a few weeks ago, and we drove down to see them with my whole family. And after my wife and the kids went to bed, I sat with my parents on their deck, and I had 2 printed copies of the screenplay for them, and they read it.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And I had come to expect, based on some conversations I had with people, that it was going to get pretty crazy, because this was basically me communicating to them through the screenplay the same way that your dad communicated to you through those YouTube videos. I was just using a different medium, right? And at one point, my dad is reading, my mom's reading, and I have to kind of like look over their shoulders to see what pages they're on, just so I can follow along. And they're pretty quiet. And at one point, my dad looks up and just nonchalantly, matter-of-factly says, you never had to prove anything to me. And then he just keeps reading. And I was like, oh my God. Like, that shook me, because that was the statement that I had been looking for so many years, right? And there's one part in the screenplay where he says, why can't you just be proud of me, right? To his dad. And I actually told him, just keep reading, responding with sarcasm, almost the same way that your dad responded to you, but it was such an interesting experience, because to me, it was like, wow, this is what it took for me to hear from him, literally nonchalantly, and what I had been wanting to hear all those years. And it also showed me that actually, maybe it's true. Maybe I never had to prove anything to him, but the way that he was pushing me was because he thought that I wasn't living up to my full potential. And so in the same way that this cookbook is bringing you and your dad closer together, but through you being able to see some of his perspective, maybe him being able to see some of your perspective, it was the same thing with the screenplay.
One thing I think I realize throughout working on this, and I'm sure you can probably relate to this, Max, is that throughout this process, I realize my dad was way smarter and wiser than I give him credit for,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. My dad realized, oh, my son is way smarter and wiser than I give him credit for.
Right.
So it's like, and it took a cookbook, it took your screenplay. For others, it would take a piece of poetry, a song, a work of art, a painting, whatever it is, right? But it's amazing how you have, a stack of 70 pages on printed paper. That is the conduit for understanding. 70 sheets of paper, or however long your screenplay is, 370 pages for my cookbook. It's like this inanimate physical object that weighs 3 pounds has like so much meaning and like symbolism in this thing, which is like when you look at it, you think, this is amazing that I'm holding this in my hands.
Yeah.
You're
holding a conduit in your hands.
Yeah. Like this is 40 some odd years of, of complexity and strife and misunderstanding, but encapsulated in this 3-pound book, which is like, oh my God, it's kind of crazy to think about it.
Totally. I mean, maybe there's something to the fact that, we see our kids as kids. And to us, like, I say to my girls, like, you're always going to be my babies, right? But at some point, they grow up and they mature. And at some point, you have to sort of shift your understanding of who they are as people and their maturity level, because then you can start to have some of those deeper conversations with them. But most parents probably want to be perceived the way that we perceived our parents when you were younger, which is invincible, omnipotent, kind of, unfallible, right? But at some point, if you keep that up, your relationship will suffer with your kids. Like at some point, you have to show vulnerability, because otherwise, they're going to see you the way that you and I saw our dads.
Right.
At some point, there has to be an inflection point, but they grow up so gradually that it's hard for us to be like, maybe now I can bring this up, or maybe now I can bring this up. Like I always err on the side of, no, I don't want to bring any of that up. But I feel like on some level, that's, putting me in the same position that I was in with my dad.
I was going to respond to that with like, at least we have like the foresight to like recognize this and think about this. But then as soon as I said that, I realized, who's to say that my parents also did not see this and realize this and just like never got a chance of doing that? Like maybe they were just as conscious about that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, what if this is just history repeating itself? Like
Totally.
So again, understanding that we need to give them more credit than what we think that they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the fact that we're like conscious and like recognize that this is happening, I think is really important. But again, who's to say that our parents, we think, well, what do they know? Maybe they did know, and we just don't know it.
Maybe they did. I mean, my wife and I talk about this all the time. It's like, are we doing the right thing? Are we being good parents? And are we giving our kids enough resources and teaching them enough? And remember, I was talking to somebody a couple of years ago, and their response to that sort of stuck out in my mind. And now I give it as advice to people that ask me the same question. The advice is, if you're asking the question, then you're probably within the margins of what's acceptable, because there are a lot of parents that don't even ask the question.
Yeah.
Now that you are closer with your dad and you have so much more insight into sort of both sides of the story, how has that influenced your parenting with your little one?
I think that it makes me like rewind back to my memories when I was like 7 or 8 and how I perceived my parents, and it made me realize that feeling that I'm feeling, whatever it is, however, irrational my 7-year-old brain was back then, is probably the way that my son is probably perceiving me now. And so this is very much like walking a mile in their shoes, but like sort of in reverse. It's like I walked a mile. Now I understand how you're walking a mile. And I think that's made me much more conscious about how I should react in certain situations.
Yeah.
You know, um, you know, uh, I, I can sense probably like a few years ago I could be like way more impatient and way more impulsive and reacting and reactive to these things, but now it's like there's a little birdie that just tells me it's like wait a minute, is this how you want to react? So basically it's just like something that just holds you back before you um sort of revert to that monkey brain reaction, that primordial reaction. So I think it's just more about now in my brain now, it gives me like a split second more to like reflect and go, do you want to like yell and scream and, in reaction to your kid spilling a glass of milk onto the ground, right? So it has added a split second buffer in my parental brain.
That's a massive win.
Yeah.
It's a massive win.
It's just a 0.37 seconds is all it takes, and
literally,
and hopefully, and I understand now when you think of like these old folks with with their sage wisdom. I think this just might be that's what it is. It's just having more time to reflect and think, and not needing to say the first thing that comes out of your mouth. I tend to start speaking without my brain consciously knowing how I'm going to finish the sentence, but I just feel the need. I just need to start talking, right? And now I think it's okay to pause and like take a second to ponder. And it's like, you know what? It's fine to do that. And like same thing parentally, it just gives you like a split second more to pause and reflect.
Totally. Yeah, silence is only uncomfortable for people that, that maybe don't trust their gut as much, right? Like silence is actually not a bad thing.
And it's kind of like, it's kind of powerful thing to have. It's like, when you're the person in a meeting, in a work meeting, you just like babble on and on and on. I don't know if some folks view that as like insecurity. I don't know. But I remember a boss where you would ask a question and she would just sit and wait and think about it for a second and then respond. And I'm like, in those 5 seconds of silence, I thought, man, that's powerful. Like you are the boss for a reason. Like that's a really powerful trait to have. So I've learned to embrace silence, and and I know that we're here also to talk about story. And I think one way of sort of bringing it back to the idea of story is that like we don't necessarily need to fill every part of what the story that we're telling with forward action with because I think the brain also does need some time to process and reflect. And I think building in those moments of silence and just let things sit in the air and ponder for a second, I think that's a really, really powerful trait.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why they call it a theatrical pause.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, so let's talk about storytelling. So you've obviously heard and told some amazing and powerful stories in your life, and you've used multiple media to tell those stories. So what, in your opinion, do good stories have in common?
Good stories almost always have something at stake.
Yep.
I mean, this is every single fairy tale since, time immemorial, like is someone has this perfectly happy life. Something happens and it just like disrupts that world.
Mm-hmm.
Something goes missing. Someone loses something, and then they have to try to restore order from chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, to me, I mean, gosh, untold volumes have been written about how to tell stories, but I think at the heart of it, it's just about you have stasis, you have uniformity, and then chaos is introduced, and you try your damnedest and hardest to restore that chaos into harmony again.
Mm-hmm.
And the consequences of not restoring that chaos, you know, it could be small, it could be big, it could be existentially important. But you certainly don't want to lose whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you have your reasons for wanting to make sure that you don't lose it,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So it's just chaos and order. I think that's what all storytelling is.
Totally. And even better if restoring order comes at some cost to the protagonist.
Yeah. 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 And I think we, as young storytellers, I think certainly when I was in my 20s, it was, it's very easy to look at like storytelling as like this very simple framework as conflict resolution. All right. And you lose something, you find it, and it's happily ever after. Well, I think as you grow older, you realize that happily ever after doesn't really happen,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's like sometimes you only get some of that order back.
Yeah.
You become a changed person at the end of it. And I think that's probably the bigger thing is that like you were this person before and then you become this person afterward. And what is that shift? What's that emotional shift, right? What's the spiritual shift? And it's not as binary as like conflict and resolution.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's way more complicated than that. But basically, I think all stories go from one place, go somewhere else, and then it's understanding the effects of what that change does to that person. That to me, I think, is very instructive in understanding how humans work. And I think at the end of the day, we just want to better understand what this complex mass of flesh called humanity, like what it works and how do we become better at it.
Totally. Now, does every story have to have a moral?
I don't think so. I think that I should rephrase that. I think people try to jam morality down people's throats and in a very explicit way that feels oftentimes quite forced. And I think that when you say moral, I also don't think it's an either or thing. There are different shades of it, there are different spectrums of it,
Mm-hmm.
and there are different degrees of it. And I think rather than looking at it as like, should every story have a moral, I am looking at it as, should you force morality into every story? I look at it that way. And I think the answer is no. I think when I'm also thinking about moral, and I'm glad, the title of your show has that word in it, right? It's about understanding, like I said, how we live, how do we become better humans, what we can learn from other people's mistakes. And I think while not necessary to have it, I think it does make the story worthwhile and actually makes it worth listening to. Because otherwise, why did you just spend 30 minutes listening to it, watching this, reading this, if it was all sort of meaningless? So I think it's good to have it. Is it necessarily to always have it? Probably not. Should you be forcing it down people's throats? Definitely not.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an art in letting that unfurl and letting the reader, the viewer, the listener come to that conclusion themselves. And I think that's probably even the more powerful thing is when they have that aha moment.
Yeah.
I love it when comedians at a stand-up act, right? They will tell a joke, but they don't give the punchline because the punchline is filled in the head of the listener. And then you can slowly hear murmurs of laughter from the audience, like building. You're like, I get it. I see what they're saying, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing you do this with morality in a story, in a tale. It's that you don't force it upon them, but they discover it themselves. All we're doing as storyteller is we're unearthing this thing for you to then discover.
Yeah.
That if you can do that, that is magic. That is art right there.
Totally. You're giving more credit to your audience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So last couple of questions here. You mentioned Anti-Fragile as a book that you love. Tell me about maybe one or two other books that you love that really nail the art of storytelling.
I never read a lot of John Steinbeck when I was young, and I started reading him voraciously as an adult. And I think my favorite Steinbeck is not the one that everyone's going to say, which is not Grapes of Wrath, which is not to say that's not a brilliant book, but I love East of Eden. And I think that's a book that I read later in my adult life. And it's a story about two families and how they live. And, it's not necessarily conflict resolution in the traditional sense, but just seeing how they live and how they react and their dynamics with each other. That to me is a book that stays with me, has stayed with me long afterward. And one thing I'm reading now that I'm really enjoying is, Steinbeck would keep a journal that he would start the day out before he would got to work and writing the actual novel. Mm-hmm. He would start the day by writing a letter to his editor. And he would write about everything from, these are the troubles I'm having. He would write about his love life too, which is kind of wow, I can't believe you're telling people that. Just about anything at all, just, about living in New York and the troubles that he's having. And he did this as a way of it's a warm-up exercise for the actual act of writing the novel. And I'm quite enjoying reading the East of Eden's letters that he wrote, because it's really fun to read it in parallel with reading that novel as well. He also did this with Grapes of Wrath as well too. But I find, in addition to that book, reading the letters of E.B. White, of John Steinbeck, of Ernest Hemingway, right? Like this, it's almost like the equivalent of reading people's emails today, right?
Yeah.
But back then, there was so much gold to be mined from those correspondences, and you sort of learn a lot about the problems that they endure, the roadblocks that they face. And I think you can learn a lot about writing from reading those. So anyway, I would say, number one, East of Eden, John Steinbeck, but then also the East of Eden letters that he wrote to his editor. Those two things, I'm just they're really, really profound to me.
Oh, I love that. And it makes you appreciate the book more, reading the letters.
Yes. Oh, and I can't wait to read East of Eden again. It's almost like watching The Simpsons. When you're 13, you watch it, it's one thing.
Yep.
And then you watch it again in your 30s, you think this is brilliant, because this is a show that is different for when you're 13 and when you're 33.
Exactly.
And it's wow, this is really brilliant. So I really can't wait to dive into old episodes of all these jokes and adult references that you don't get, that they wrote just for the adult version of the viewer.
Yep.
And I feel the same way if I'm reading Steinbeck again. So I can't wait to dive in, but I'll do that after this book tour, maybe when I have some time to read again.
Yes, you are quite the busy man with the new book, which we'll talk about in a sec. But the last question I have for you is, if you had a few minutes with 20-year-old Kevin Peng, that young, brash, recalcitrant, stubborn, intelligent, ambitious young man, if you had a couple of minutes with him, what would you say to him?
I heard this in a show, I forgot where, a few weeks ago, and it wasn't about personal advice. It wasn't about writing. It was about how to have a long-term relationship. And this person said the three most important words with a spouse is not "I love you," but "let it go." And I thought, wow, that is true. Let it go. Of course, it also makes me think of the Frozen song, which that sort of like really annoys me because I can't help but to hear that now. But I think, if you just let go a lot of the your anger and all the anxiety and just what does it really mean at the end? Probably not a lot.
Yeah.
So just let it go. Let it go.
Let it go.
Adina Menzel said it best. So let it go. I think it's a really good life philosophy.
Let it go. If you just zoom out enough, you'll realize that so many things that we think matter now actually don't.
Totally. Yeah. It's I'll tell you one more thing too. I think I heard it might have been Tim Ferriss or someone else said it, but he said let's say you're driving down the road and you get this flat tire, right? And you can be really, really upset and angry at that moment. And he said, at that moment, you need to think about in 6 months from whatever's happening right now, will you still be angry about it the way that you're feeling now? And the answer is almost emphatically no. Mm-hmm. So don't why add anxiety now when in 6 months, who cares?
Totally.
You know? So I really like that framework. It's saying ask yourself, will the person in 6 months still be angry about this current situation you're feeling? It's okay to feel emotionally upset or annoyed, right? But it's you don't really need to let it fester. And at the end of the day, you should just let it go.
Totally. I love that. Great advice. Well, that does it. Kevin Pang, author, talk show host, so many other wonderful things. And I will say again, foodie of the highest caliber. Thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Max. What a pleasure.
So Kevin has a book coming out with his father, Jeffrey, 370 pages of gold, Cantonese cuisine cookbook entitled A Very Chinese Cookbook. It is out on October 24th. Make sure you get that. For show notes and more, head over to mospod.org. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast on. This was Moral of the Story. I'm Max Czapowski. Thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.